Ich habe die undankbare Aufgabe, diese wirklich schöne Gesprächssituation auf der Galerie und nach dem Mittagessen jetzt so langsam zurückzubringen, uns in den Saal zurückzubringen. Also wie gesagt, für alle, die Sie gerade noch auf der Galerie sind, es sieht auch fantastisch aus, wie Sie sich da unterhalten. Genau dafür machen wir das ja. Und ehrlich gesagt, wenn Sie mal selber in die Verlegenheit kommen, eine Tagung oder eine Konferenz zu organisieren, ein fast runder Saal hat einige Nachteile, aber für eine Poster-Session ist er wirklich ganz hervorragend geeignet. Nichtsdestotrotz, wie gesagt, bitte ich uns alle, langsam wieder runterzukommen. Denn für uns steht nun an ein Programmpunkt, den Simone Kaiser heute Morgen vollkommen zu Recht als ein Highlight gewertet hat. Sowieso ist es ein Highlight, wenn wir im Rahmen dieser Konferenz alle in einem Raum zusammenkommen und unseren Fokus auf eine Situation lenken. Das ist ja immer dieses Wechselspiel aus den kleineren Formaten oder Leute sind in Ateliers, arbeiten sehr intensiv und dementsprechend ist diese gemeinsam verbrachte Zeit in so einem Raum ja auch nochmal besonders wertvoll. Und da muss man sich natürlich auch immer fragen, mit was füllt man sie? Wie will man das auch rechtfertigen, dass man diese sehr wertvolle Zeit beansprucht? Und im Rahmen der PartWiss ist uns sehr wichtig, Perspektiven zusammenzubringen. Und mit dieser Keynote haben wir etwas geschafft, eine Perspektive einzubringen, die wir in den vergangenen beiden Jahren tatsächlich so explizit und so deutlich auch noch nicht in einer Keynote, in einem zentralen Vortrag hatten. Denn wir haben heute Teun Zuiderent-Jerak zu Gast. Ich stelle ihn kurz vor. Er ist Professor für Transdisciplinary Science und Technology Studies an der Freien Universität Amsterdam in den Niederlanden. Und seine Forschung konzentriert sich sehr auf transdisziplinäre Sozialstudien im Bereich Gesundheitswesen und Medizin. Und es umfasst die Untersuchung zum Beispiel von Evidenzbewertung in Bezug auf verschiedene Wissensformen, aber auch die Standardisierung von Wissen und die Verbesserung der Gesundheitsversorgung sowie die Entwicklung von Technologien auch für so eine partizipative und integrative Gesundheitsversorgung. Und in seiner Arbeit bringt Teun dabei zwei Aktivitäten zusammen, die uns auch schon seit der ersten PartWiss immer wieder eigentlich als widersprüchlich begegnet werden. Und das eine ist eben das Schaffen von wissenschaftlichem Wissen, von Erkenntnis, wie wir es gestern auf dem Podium auch schon hatten, der Artikel in der Zeitschrift. Und zum Zweiten etwas, worüber wir selbst im Kontext von partizipativer und transdisziplinärer Forschung noch nicht so deutlich immer sprechen, nämlich das Eingreifen. Also wirklich die Intervention auch in Praktiken, auch vielleicht mit dem Ziel, sie eben zu verbessern. Und ich möchte noch eine Sache herausheben, neben seiner Arbeit, ich war so frei, einen Buchtitel mit auf die Folie zu nehmen. Es gibt noch einen weiteren, den ich nicht drauf habe, der heißt nämlich Situated Intervention von 2015, auch bei MIT Press. Da schlägt er ein Theorie- und Methodenpaket vor, wie man diese Intervention verstehen und auch dann machen kann. Aber unter Making and Doing kennen vielleicht diejenigen von euch und Ihnen, die hin und wieder auf Science and Technology Studies Konferenzen unterwegs sind, denn er hat damals auch ganz wesentlich dafür mit Verantwortung getragen, dass es auf der großen Konferenz dazu einen eigenen Track gibt, wo nur diese sehr transformativen Formate, wo vielleicht gar kein Paper am Ende draus gekommen ist, sondern etwas entstanden ist oder vielleicht auch was nicht geklappt hat, Anerkennung bekommen. Die bekommen dort eine Fläche, die können dort sichtbar werden. Es gibt auch einen Award innerhalb der Fachgemeinschaft dort. Und das Tolle ist, das wussten wir nicht zu dem Zeitpunkt, als wir Teun, und das hat vor allem Julie Mewis gemacht, angefragt haben, diese Arbeit, die er da in der Fachgemeinschaft geleistet hat, die kann er bald noch an sehr viel prominenterer Stelle machen. Es wurde nämlich vergangene Woche angekündigt, dass Teun auch der kommende Präsident der Europäischen Fachgemeinschaft für die Science and Technology Studies ist. Und deswegen sind wir umso froher, ihn heute hier zu haben. Und damit übergebe ich das Wort an dich, lieber Teun.
Ja, ganz vielen Dank, Sebastian, für diese herzliches Willkommen, so wie heute Morgen auch schon so herzlich. Erstmal die Sprache. Ich habe mich überlegt, vielleicht mache ich es auf Deutsch. Aber ich bin Autodidakt, das heißt, ich habe das gelernt, weil ich mit meinen Schwiegereltern reden musste. Und das heißt, ich habe ein holländisch und schwäbisches Akzent. Ich glaube, das ist ein Unikum. Aber ich glaube auch, es ist ein bisschen zu schwierig. Aber wenn Sie fragen, weil es ist konzeptuell und ich kann über ganz viele Sachen reden, über ganz viele Sachen, die in Deutschland üblich sind. Aber meine Konzepte sind ein bisschen schwieriger. Deswegen, ich mache es auf Englisch, aber wenn Sie Fragen haben, auf Deutsch, sehr gerne und ich versuche dazu zu sprechen und die Dativfehler, die können Sie dazu genießen. Ja, auch ganz vielen Dank für die Einladung, vor allem Judy an das ganze Team. Und ich muss sagen, von heute Morgen, was mir vor allem beigeblieben ist, dass ich bin einfach ganz beeindruckt, dass es so eine Stelle gibt, wo ganz verschiedene Teilen und Arten und Formen von Partizipativwissenschaften zusammenkommen, nicht um zu diskutieren, über welche die richtige ist, aber wie man vielleicht zusammen auch was voneinander lernen kann und auch eine Politikerkraft haben kann oder schaffen kann durch das Zusammenkommen. Das Kollektivisieren ist wirklich sehr stark und wir versuchen das auch ein bisschen in Holland jetzt zu machen, aber wir haben viel zu lernen hier. Deswegen ganz beeindruckt und genieße auch, dass ihr das habt, vor allem. Aber ich glaube, das macht ihr. Yes, so the talk itself, when I was invited to talk about this topic of guidelines, participation, I had a little bit the same reaction as you had, like, oh no, not guidelines for participation. And then I realized, oh, but maybe I have been part of making some. So I want to present a little bit about the criteria that we developed to value scholarship, transformative scholarship that includes lots of forms of participation as scholarship. And I'm not sure that that's already so central in the Richtfaden that you have developed. So maybe that's still something that I can bring to it. I will also explain how that plays in my own work through my own involvement in medical guideline development. And I think it's an interesting space because it's what I call a epistemically charged setting. It's a setting in which it's very difficult to make certain types of knowledge count as knowledge, which I think the working group I visited in the session before the lunch, all the people there who work on health participatory research will be very aware of, but I'll explain it a bit. So in science and technology studies, and this is sort of the starting point for the work I'm presenting, I don't think we agree on much. Probably the same for the Participationswissenschaften here. But if we were to agree on anything, I think we would say it's an essential finding that the development of knowledge and technology are non-linear. So it doesn't travel from the university to other spaces. There's always all forms of translation and all kinds of things that happen in that process. Another one is that, of course, technoscience itself is world-making. It's not sort of describing practices, it's making practices, even especially when it's claiming to be descriptive. And it's not just talk, it's also about material agency that makes what practices are about. Now, one of the questions I've had for quite a while is, if these are quite essential findings, why haven't they been applied more consistently to our own work? Why do we study scientific practices and describe these are things that you can see there? But what does that mean for the linearity of our own work? How can our own work become less nonlinear? And of course, then it becomes more participative or participatory and also more experimental. That means we have to try out different stuff to generate flows of translation. So I think the main reason for that is because, as many fields, science and technology studies has been caught in what I've called a dual fear. And that's probably your worst guide if you want to do interesting scholarly work. Sort of this dual fear of either being too detached or being too involved. And I think it may have played out a bit in the conversation this morning. I'm not sure, but it's about like, when do we count this as good scholarship? And how do we relate that to being participatory? It's actually really odd that would be a contradiction, right? That's somewhat of a strange notion, but I think that comes from that dual fear. And in science and technology, or in STS, you see that back in the two strands of it, science, technology, and society, which was about sort of societal engagement and came up from the 70s and with also that spirit, that participatory spirit in it, and sort of the professionalization in science and technology studies, which studied the practices of science and technology. And it came with a hierarchy as well, about which is the more true academic, intellectually intense, etc. kind of knowing. So in the book Situated Intervention, I draw on Deleuze, who calls this type of problem a badly posed problem, because it severely limits your imagination about how you could relate to your field. If you have to choose, because it proposes an axis of detached and involved, and then you have to worry about where do I stand, rather than, is something interesting happening? Am I learning something? Am I contributing something that's meaningful? For whom? Those kind of questions. So that tension, I think, has been in many fields for a long time. For example, in the sociology in the 1960s, the urban sociology, with sociologists studying the projects and studying the housing projects in the US and studying sort of deviant practices, but taking them seriously in their work. So how do you justify that you study marginalized groups that are also sort of morally marginalized? And how do you make sure that you actually don't become what Howard Becker calls sentimental about wanting to do good for them, or how do you balance that? So Howard Becker had, I think, a really interesting reading of how to relate to our fields in that way. He says that it's usually we take the side of the underdog, but how do you make sure that that's not at odds with doing good quality work, that it's about I'm more engaged than detached or than academic? You have to make sure that you avoid sentimentality. And that means avoiding, making sure you don't worry about finding out what's going on, if to know would be to violate some sympathy that you have. And I find that happens quite often in my own transdisciplinary work. I'll give an example of that in just a moment. He also said that you should study impartially. That means you have to design your methods in such a way that the belief to which you're specifically sympathetic could be proven untrue. And he also states that there's a difference between being accused of taking sides and taking sides, because if you sort of study a group that's marginalized in the same way as you would study another group, you'll be accused of taking sides while actually you're just doing your work. Another important source, I think, for thinking through how we can relate to our fields is about how do we make sure our normative positions are enough about learning. And for this, I draw on the work of Georges Canguilhem in The Normal and the Pathological. He was a biologist, so he draws his thinking from biological organisms, and he says that if a biological organism reproduces the same response despite of changing circumstances, it's dead. So a normativity that's always the same in spite of changing circumstances is equally dead. So he says that, you know, a normality that's open to possible future correction is authentic or health, because it can continue to live. And normality limited to maintaining itself, hostile to any variations in the themes that express it, and incapable of adapting to new situations is normativity is normality devoid of normative intention. So why do I bring this here in a workshop on participatory science? Because I think we often come in with a certain commitment and a certain normative idea about a community we want to work with, to then sometimes find out that our normativities are being challenged. Some of the work I do at the moment is with homeless individuals in India, and we're trying to set up extended recovery programs with them through homeless shelters. And one of the difficulties we're finding is that they have a very biomedical understanding, many of them, of recovery. That means symptom reduction up to the level that you can go back to work. And we're trying to learn with them what it means to have an extended recovery that's much more about, you know, changing your life situation so that you don't fall back so easily. That means we have to undo some of their biomedical understandings and to learn how to undo that. That's not how I typically approach patient knowledge, right? I mean, there's still a wish in me that there is a kind of deep, wise learning in living with a disease. And there is, but it's a wisdom that's also problematic. So this kind of scholarship that is experimental and more participatory oriented and transformation oriented and interested in learning from that process is very much on the rise in science and technology studies through all kinds of initiatives, but I think especially through this Making and Doing program that you just mentioned as well. And it's a program that was really set up to try to make experimental work count as scholarship. So I think this kind of work, I've been collaborating with Gary Downey from Virginia Tech and many others in building that program. And Gary calls this infrastructural scholarship. So it's actually about making these kind of infrastructures to make scholarship count as that. And I chose not to play the movie here. There's a couple nice movies on that kind of work online if you want to have a look later. But when we set up that program, we had a long discussion about, are we going to connect awards to these or not? And I was very much against it. I thought, no, please, not again. This is what got us out of, which made this work not count in the first place, that kind of like logic of trying to make things count in metrics, and this is the better, and this is how we never get to make this work count. But there was also strong pushback about saying, well, this is the only way, or one of the few ways in which we can make this kind of work count as scholarship, as good research, as it was this morning mentioned by the person from the ministry, excellent. How do you actually show that there is really good work happening in these kind of areas? So in the coda of the Making and Doing book, and it's I'm not doing a sales pitch, it's open access, even though it's MIT, you can just download it. We go into the development of those criteria. And we have four criteria that we developed to assess these very different projects, very different kinds of work. And they are about how do you make them also count in terms of your knowledge production. So the first two criteria are about, are they actually connected to ongoing debates around the production of knowledge, technology, politics, and other STS-related practices? This is one way to make sure that it's not enough to just pick up a few methods and think you're doing good scholarship in this area, right? But also, is it sort of combining critical thinking and creativity? Does it actually offer an analysis that contributes to problematizing, understanding and problematizing knowledge and expertise in creative ways? So these two are really about making sure that award-winning projects are also sort of doing compelling expressions of STS work, that it's not just methods. It's also really about the debates those methods are connected to. It's always theory, methods, packages. Two other ones. One of them is about conceptual development. This speaks to the nonlinearity. If science is nonlinear and concepts change when they travel because they get transformed by others, that might happen to our own concepts as well. So what do we learn about our own normativities, but also about our own theoretical notions when doing more experimental, more participatory work? And finally, the consequences and responses. Has it just been a kind of a conceptual smart thing, or has it also really led to transformations and new areas for action or inquiry? So this is what we call flows of learning. The flows of learning that happen between scholars and many others in those fields. And that also makes sure that this gets to count as scholarship. So what are we learning? So at stake in STS making and doing are these things. It's about the experimental and interconnected production of new knowledge, new worlds, but also new normativities. Through the flows of learning that happen sort of in the in-between of the scholar and those fields. So it's about, focusing mostly on the unexpected things that happen there. Now those flows of learning, and this is the last conceptual bit I'll do, don't worry. These flows of learning, I'll get to the case soon, I find are really well captured by the thinking of Michel Serres about becoming what he calls third instructed. Basically this is about giving up the comforts of disciplinary specialism and risking yourself, or risk putting yourself into perpetual translation. And I think with Richtvaden, that could lead to, I understand their political force, but it could lead to a kind of looking for a kind of disciplinary safety. And I don't think it has to. But that would be one thing I'd like us to keep in mind. Like, how do we actually put ourselves into perpetual translation? How do we make sure we don't worry too much about, are we participating, everyone, but are we also participating enough in other worlds, for example? So where do we place ourselves? So I'd like to go into the topic. There's not a clock here, is there? All these people are dead, of course, so there's some timeless realms they're in. Long time scales, enjoy them. Could you give me a sign when it's past? Yeah. And it's not yet? 7 minutes. Okay, thank you. Yes, so I want to focus a little bit on what it means to put yourself into perpetual translation, which I'm trying to do, in relation to guideline development in the clinical sphere, especially in relation to evidence-based medicine. And I'm happy to have discussions with you about whether this is participatory or not. Am I allowed to be at this conference? So one of the problems or portrayed problems with EBM is evidence-based medicine is that it works from a hierarchy of evidence. And that hierarchy of evidence places, as you see a little bit here, expert opinion on the bottom. So the kind of people we like to work with are not even in this period, right? So the lowest is expert opinion. If you want to talk about patient knowledge, you'd have to argue that they're lay experts and you're already out. On the top, it's randomized controlled trials, so large studies or even meta-reviews of them that work with high numbers and mostly statistical understandings of what counts as important knowledge. Now, this has been criticized very much in the social sciences for its epistemic, well, the problematic epistemic understandings of knowledge and the very narrow ones of them. So at some point I wanted to go back to the actual reference that criticizes this, and I went back to the original paper by Dave Sackett and colleagues about evidence-based medicine and where they were trying to define it. And this is what I found in that paper. They actually said that it's not restricted to randomized trials and meta-analysis. It's about tracking down the best external evidence with which to answer our clinical... Oh, thank you. You're wonderful. With which to answer our clinical questions. And then they actually give a list of kinds of questions for which this is not the best model of knowledge production. But what they specify is that for therapy questions, it is the most important model because it has the lowest risk of false positives. So that means if you're testing the effectiveness of a drug, these are methods through which you have the lowest chance of false positives, which is important because pharmaceutical companies have a really high interest in false positives. Because that means that even if they're not so fantastic, then they can still argue that, no, these are good and they should be reimbursed. So that's quite a different understanding of why these people are such weird, epistemically narrow people, right? It's actually out of a concern about the risk of including knowledges that are politically problematic to include. So I don't actually think this is what they've done. They haven't done this, like, specify the method according to the question you've got. Actually, what they've done is they do work according to this pyramid quite substantially. But it's sort of a strategically literal reading of evidence-based medicine to say, oh, but even your founders said this was not what you were supposed to be doing. Actually, you should be much more open in what kind of knowledges you need to answer a certain question. So that makes it not so much a problem of a problematic epistemic understanding, but a problem of knowledge infrastructures. There have been extensive knowledge infrastructures developed to weigh different kind of clinical trials in relation to other clinical trials and how to include and exclude them based on all kinds of different specific criteria that you should use. But there haven't been the same kind of methods development for how do you do inclusion of other types of knowledge in good ways. For example, patient knowledge. There has been some, but not much. So one of the things I did in, I think it was 2010, was to set up a working group on appraising and including different knowledge within the Guidelines International Network, the professional association for guideline developers, together with epidemiologists who were equally frustrated about the fact that they never had the right knowledge to make good recommendations because they were all being excluded according to this hierarchy. But I also found myself buying into part of their logic, because I'd also been doing lots of observations of guideline development groups where they'd just then been discussing in detail, are we going to include this study or not? And then there came a deck of slides with a focus group where 7 patients had been discussing something, and this is what came out. So this was clearly not, this was never going to come together. The only thing they could do, if they were very sympathetic, is put those in the appendix. Okay. So I've been interested in questions of how do we explore more frequentist approaches to patient knowledge if you want to be able to include those in guideline development. Mostly also exploring the possibilities of digital methods for doing participation. As I said, you're happy to say that's not participation. But people are already having lots of conversations about certain experiences they have regarding to certain illnesses. For example, the example I'll discuss is on scabies. So the question, how do you move from this lots of different posts online to changes in a clinical guideline that's being developed according to evidence-based medicine? So this was a project in which I've been working together with the Dutch version of the Robert Koch Institute, scholars at the Social AI Department and of the Athena Institute, and we're a transdisciplinary research institute at the VU. So how do you include experience in this national scabies guidelines, Kretze? I thought I'd better put it there. What we did for that is analyze existing sets of textual records where people are already expressing themselves about their experiences. And mostly through online posts by citizens, currently patients. We used AI methods from the field of natural language processing, especially sentiment analysis, which is They're packages that you can run on data sets to actually filter out which posts use words that people typically use when they really care about something deeply. Like they can also be rude, or they can be, but sentiment analysis, which of course in clinical studies, sentiments would be a bad thing. But here we actually use it to highlight posts with high sentiment. And topic modeling is a method in which you take a series of contributions, and the algorithm organizes those into topics based on co-word findings. So it makes clusters of topics that seem to be talking about something similar. Of course, it doesn't mean you know what it's about. For that, you have to start reading why were these put in one cluster. And we had the plan to work with interactive methods from Transdisciplinary STS to focus on this knowledge inclusion part in the guideline process. I'll come back to that in a moment. Very briefly on what we found in this topic modeling on living with scabies. So this is what I mean with frequentism. All of a sudden you can say, oh, we analyzed nearly 6,000 posts. And these were structured, not by us, but by the algorithms, into certain clusters that were about these kind of topics. And we were, of course, you first have to find a channel. In this case, the big discussion on scabies turned out to take place on doctor.nl. So what these topics are about are names that we gave to them, right? So that should be clear. This is not AI, is not smart, of course, but it can do co-word things. The computer scientists we work with this, by the way, they call it human-in-the-loop AI, which is really sweet because it's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, well, where do you think the other AI came from? But okay. So these topics, some of the topics that came up and that we presented to the guideline group, for example, were about the importance of these online communities because people are extremely ashamed. It's a disease that is on the rise. And it's still sort of known as a poverty disease. So that means people who have it are typically really ashamed of having it and feel super dirty. And this is finally a space where they can express themselves. You can try to recreate that setting through other participatory methods, but it's not easy. First of all, to get people to come to a space where they're willing to discuss that they have scabies is going to be really hard. The itching is horrible. The itching is horrible. And many posts were just about people actually really losing their minds over this continuous itching and also the fear of the itching coming back. Because of the stigma and because of this being seen as a poverty disease, still, we read the initial version of the guideline. It was horrible. It was full of stigmatizing language. This is typically something you find in, what was it, prisons, asylum seeking centers, and it was like none of us would ever feel safe to say you have, after reading that guideline, you wouldn't, well, unless you're very proud of having been in prison, but so it means it took very long for people to get diagnosed because GPs, the huisartsen, they also have that stigma. So it took people forever to get the diagnosis, and of course all that time they were going crazy with the itching. And it's very expensive because you have to wash your clothes all the time on high temperatures and you have to put them in the dryer. And of course with the energy costs of the last years, this has been no joke for many people, for example students, but of course also anyone who's living in some form of poverty. The consequence of this, so people are ashamed, they're going crazy with their itching, it took a long time to diagnose, there's shortages in the medication process, in the production process, and it's very expensive. So by the time people get their medication, what happens? They overdose. They start to overtreat in the hope that once you finally now have your medication, you get rid of the disease more easily, which doesn't really happen, you just get more side effects. Another thing we found is that people were posting about the use of tea tree oil to treat their scabies rather than through the medication. And those were not necessarily people who were sort of big fans of tea tree oil as such, but people who were traveling, couldn't get their medication, started to read online, thought, oh, maybe I should just try this because I can't get my medication here, but I can get 2 bottles of tea tree oil, and actually realized it's really effective. This is really working, much better than the junk that the doctors were giving me. Now I thought, how are we going to present this to this guideline development group? It's going to be a nightmare, because it's about effectiveness of therapy. And you've got a few people talking about it. You don't have the large clinical trial. Fortunately, my PhD students are smarter than me. So Leah Lush, who you just saw in one of the pictures, she went to the literature to find out, are there actually studies that discuss the use of tea tree oil in the treatment of scabies? And yes, there is emerging evidence that shows that it could well be working to treat scabies. So we presented these things back to the guideline development group. And what happened? The experience about stigma and sort of those life world parts were surprisingly easily incorporated in the guideline. Actually, this guideline developer, she was really enthusiastic. She really said, this is fantastic. There would have been no way I could have gotten this. What she did was she wrote a section on mental health. And I'm not sure that high energy bills are necessarily about mental health. But that professionals could then take into account when giving their recommendations for treatment, and also really warn people, don't overtreat, because it won't help, it will do you harm. So burden of treatment, of course, is something they're also aware of. It was impossible for us to get the tea tree oil mentioned in the guideline. They weren't going to do it, and they said, no, emerging evidence is not good enough. We only go with the evidence that's really substantive and that we are able to show in those larger studies. And of course, this is when I realized, like, where did the participation practices about the knowledge inclusion go? We couldn't have done the participation to get the knowledge, but we sort of actually ended up not having mobilized owners of that knowledge in that guideline development meeting. We, as researchers, were the ones who were trying to articulate this. But of course, it would have been different if someone who had been treating themselves with tea tree oil had been at that table in that guideline development meeting. And maybe then it would have just been a mention saying, this is emerging evidence, but take it into account. If you can't get anything, try it. See if it works. It's not particularly harmful, I think. So how does this relate back to the criteria? How does this kind of work relate back to those 4 criteria about making and doing scholarship? Is this about novel ways of relating to SDS debates about knowledge expression? Well, in some ways, I think, because digital methods do give other opportunities for including patient knowledge in guideline development. One of the most interesting experiences was that one of the guideline developers asked, don't you have a really nice illustrative quote so that we can include that in our guideline? And for some reason, that's never happened to me after having run a focus group or even in-depth interviews. It's because of the different way of presenting the work. But we also became aware that we still require strong modes of participation in the knowledge inclusion itself. Does it lead to conceptual learning? I think it does, in the sense that it's not about frequentism. It's about different frequentisms. And what we've tried to do here is produce something that, for lack of a better term for now, I'm still working on it, I think I want to call relational frequentism. Because it's actually about the relational side, the experience side, but through a frequentist mode, which makes it congruent, a bit more congruent, with guideline development practices. And it has led to an interest in continuing with these methods in living meta-reviews, but then drawing on analyses in different languages. And one of the really weird things that you might then get is patient experiences that are not dependent on language or context, and patient experiences that are. And in one of the workshops this morning, it was about, is it always local situated knowledge, or are there actually ways in which you can aggregate? Maybe it is. I'm also really a bit terrified about the idea of universal patient knowledge. So I'm not really sure where this is going. So to close, we closed the book actually with that we think this is a hopeful move. giving ourselves space for this kind of work and these kind of flows of learning in our scholarship. Because actually many of the questions about the relation between SDS and societal challenges or other participatory practices and societal challenges have really taken this form of either claims about impact that we should be making or laments about the absence of the academic contributions these are that are being made in popular debates. But we feel that that really misses the kind of scholarship that activates our concepts, our methods, our learnings, and that make our kind of sensibilities through nonlinear forms of knowledge, expression, and travel. So that's where I think these flows of learning, they're not to be underestimated. Of course, it's important work we try to do in relation to societal challenges, but it's also very often analytically super innovative what we then find, especially when things go wrong or are problematic. So, and I just really hope that, we can keep finding spaces to not make a split between our intentions and our academic, our societal intentions and our academic learnings. And that's what I was hoping to bring to this conversation. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm quite willing to take any questions. Wie gesagt, das kann auch auf Deutsch. Aber ich bin ganz froh, dass ich es nicht auf Deutsch gemacht habe.
Trying to be the first one so that everybody else has more time to think. I would be interested if you could tell a bit more about this infrastructural scholarship and how you understand also your work in this example that you gave as or not infrastructural scholarship. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I think what's happening here is a form of infrastructural scholarship. Right, there's a network that's being made that provides a kind of legitimacy, but also that shapes what counts as this kind of scholarship. And I think very often we consider this as kind of academic service. Of course, this is also a conference, so we think but to have organized this is a kind of academic service. I don't think so. I think it's not service. This is the scholarship of shaping and helping collectively to shape these kind of conversations. When the current president asked me to run for this presidency of the East Society, I was like, oh no. And then I realized, actually it's a space to do infrastructural scholarship. You can actually help create spaces where people can have these kind of conversations. And I think it's also about not just privileging our concepts. I love concepts, I love theories because they provide new action repertoires. I don't think this talk was fully untheoretical, but it's also really about what we make with that and what we learn from that. So I'd like to see things that we often see as academic service as infrastructural scholarship so that I enjoy the work more. Partly it's therapeutic. But I think it's also about not privileging only the thinking and the conceptual, but about the making of networks. I mean, in a way, maybe it's a very... of course, it's about the non-cognitive, but the felt, the embodied, There's a question.
Und das Gute ist, Infrastrukturen müssen ja auch bezahlt werden. Und das ist vielleicht auch ein gutes Argument. Infrastrukturen müssen gebaut werden, sie kosten Geld.
Genau.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering, at the beginning you mentioned briefly that you have an initiative in the Netherlands that is maybe similar to what we do here. Could you maybe say some more words on that?
Yeah, have you been more involved actually? Because I wasn't. There have been two founding meetings on a kind of a network of transdisciplinary scholarship. That seems to be a term that is like, I think because participation in the Dutch context, I don't know if it's the same here, is often not about system change, which was a topic that, of course, we discussed as well. So I think that with transdisciplinary, it's like including other knowledges as well as transformation orientedness. That seems to be more the lingo in relation to large challenges, etc. So I think what is a bit similar to here is that it's a coming together of groups that have been working on this for long times, decades, but who now also really see each other as valuable parts of that as a network. And I think I don't know exactly why, but like in earlier times, it was more of a competition between those different units. And I think this point that was made this morning, if we spend all our energy on fighting with ourselves, then when are we ever going to have energy to collectivize? And yes, differences are there, but are those the really interesting differences? Sometimes they are, to keep ourselves analytically on our toes and to understand why we do what we do, but not as a political force. Part of my work is was with transgender activists in Argentina and in Colombia. There are so many fights within the trans communities that it's really difficult to mobilize them. But if you connect their work to the Ni Una Menos movement against femicides, which actually a lot of trans violence is about, then all of a sudden you have a really strong collective, right? So I think this is also about how, and this is interesting because with our situatedness, we often look for the specific issue. What's the specifics of this kind of setting? But it can have a depoliticizing effect at times. So yeah, it's an exploration. Yes.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It really inspired me a lot. I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about this relational frequencism and how qualitative research plays a role in it. So I can totally see how a statistical method kind of aligns really well with what the risk researchers and the assessment people do.
Yeah.
But did you have previous qualitative knowledge that allowed you to build these clusters? And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I think one of the really nice things is that the methods totally don't fit the qualitative-quantitative split. And that's one of the things why I think they're generative. So at this working group of this appraising and including different knowledge working group at one of the guideline conference network conferences, Guideline International Network conferences, we had a workshop where we just asked guideline developers to try out what would be good channels for them to work with these methods. And you realize that most people developing guidelines have never actually gone online to see what people are saying about this. And they quickly came with things that really mattered for what they were doing, at least in some, not in all the cases. But for example, if you start to look for somebody who was working on a certain dementia guideline, and you realize how many informal caregivers are posting about the burden, the challenges, the difficulties, etc., all of a sudden this was a way for them to take this more seriously, because there was a statistical way to analyze this, cluster this, and turn it into different kind of groups. So I think you need a certain sensitivity for what could be at stake, which you often have developed, or I have developed through mostly doing ethnographic research or other qualitative methods. I still really love doing ethnography because of sort of the specificity and the surprises it gives me. But it also worked for people who had very little knowledge of qualitative methods, just because they found a legitimate reason for looking in these places for their guideline development, which they just hadn't considered. So but I think to do a good job in making the topics, yes, you need a bit more of an understanding of what's happening in those clusters, for which qualitative analysis skills are quite important.
No, thanks a lot. It's quite impressive. What I'd like to ask you is, how do you see perhaps different positionalities with respect to guidelines depending on the subjectivity of the researcher there and their resistance to ethnographic research as well? Because my experience also was that, like, guidelines take the position of the law, and in places where society already believes that there's a transparent, democratic, legitimate form of government, this is their form of intervening already by providing guidelines, like in Germany. This is kind of like the common belief, but in places like in Turkey, for example, where I'm from, people already position themselves apart from them, and if anything against that, to have more like a other form of virtue ethics perhaps versus providing guidelines, because they cannot. And then, you know, the resistance towards, like in societies like in Germany, there is also researchers' resistance actively against being ethnographically researched, because, you know, they might position what they are doing as purely rational, which should not be evaluated by the tools of non-cognitive ethnography, at least. Perhaps they might be open to cognitive ethnography, but that might be the end of it, perhaps. Do you encounter these challenges?
Yeah, thanks. In the conclusion of situated intervention, I write about this in terms of ecologies of intervention. It's really not up to me whether this is going to be generative. And if I find I'm in a space where there's nothing possible, then I think resistance and refusal need to be part of our repertoires as well. So refusing a project where you feel that somebody is really not displaying any kind of openness, and then still thinking through, am I just refusing this to get myself out of here, or is there a form of refusal that could also open up something? But before that, if I would be in that kind of situation, or when I am in that kind of situation, I usually first start looking for the frictions within. That's a notion I take from Sarah Kember, which I'm really inspired by, because often we also close something down too quickly as, oh, they're hostile to this. Like that sociological analysis, or that quote from the sociologist about what EBM is. And actually, Steve Brown writes about that in terms of what that means is we're organizing an away match. And then, what do you call it? Like in soccer terms, like in Fußball, Auswärts, yeah, genau. And so you're playing away because you first make this thing into a unit. But if you start to look for frictions within, there's very often people who know better what the problems are that you think you're seeing, like epidemiologists who try to develop guidelines based on the wrong kinds of knowledge, and they're upset. So in this case, especially this was prior to COVID when we set up that group, but it was mostly working with outbreak-oriented epidemiologists. Because for outbreaks, you know, you don't have your trials over for the kind of complex interventions. I mean, that's why we didn't have masks in the Netherlands during COVID for the first, I don't know how long, because we had a head of the Dutch Robert Koch who said, no, there's no evidence for using masks. And then also saying, oh, and probably people are not going to keep they're probably not going to keep distance if they wear a mask, because of course you can be a behavioral scientist without having any qualification in it. You can just throw that in yourself. So it's really about the outbreak-oriented people who are frustrated with that kind of reasoning. Then something becomes possible. And I think you can translate that to the many different settings people are working in. Usually you look for the actors within with whom you can find a different language for articulating a problem that they already have and actually know more about than you.
Ich schaue kurz auf die Uhr, Teun.
Ihr vertraut mein Deutsch nicht, ne?
Doch, ich schon.
Ah, du schon, ja, das stimmt. Das stimmt.
Lieber Teun, vielen Dank für deinen Talk. Wir haben mitgenommen, die Risse suchen, die Probleme mit umdefinieren und Teebaumöl. Teebaumöl hilft bei Krätze. Genau. Kann man probieren. Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank für deine Zeit und dass du hier bist. Wir bitten Sie und euch jetzt in die Atelierräume, beziehungsweise hier ist, glaube ich, auch sogar was. Wir haben jetzt eine volle Session, dann noch eine kleine Pause und dann wieder eine Session. Also jetzt wird nochmal richtig gearbeitet, aber dafür gibt es danach Essen, versprochen.